When a black man steps into court representing himself, the judge chuckles and the courtroom sneers. But what begins as mockery quickly turns into awe, as the man dismantles every argument with surgical precision. What the court didn't know: he's no ordinary defendant, he's a legal mastermind with a secret mission. The courtroom was already half full when Darius Bennett stepped through the double doors. His black suit, slightly faded but immaculately pressed, clung to his lean frame. He moved with quiet confidence, ignoring the stares that followed him. As he approached the defendant's table alone, the chatter in the gallery dipped for a moment, curiosity, confusion, and disbelief mixing in the air. A bailiff, flipping through the day's docket, narrowed his eyes. "No attorney with you?" the man asked, his voice clipped. "No, sir," Darius replied. "I'm representing myself." The bailiff smirked. "Good luck." Darius nodded politely and took his seat. He opened a worn leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of neatly organized folders, legal pads, and a blue hardcover book, Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. The title caught the eye of a nearby legal assistant who nudged her colleague. "This one thinks he's gonna law his way out of this with a library card," she whispered. At precisely 9 a.m., the courtroom doors opened again, this time with a deliberate slam. Judge Ronald Baxter, a tall, gray-haired man with piercing blue eyes and a robe that swayed with authority, marched to the bench. He didn't so much as glance at Darius before speaking. "Next case," he barked. "Crane versus Bennett." A sleek, confident woman in heels that clicked like gunshots across the floor approached the plaintiff's table. Whitney Crane, lead attorney for Veriton Global Inc., a tech firm known for swallowing smaller startups and crushing whistleblowers, barely glanced at Darius. She didn't need to. She'd already won this case in her mind. The judge raised an eyebrow when he looked over the paperwork. "Where's your attorney, Mr. Bennett?" "I am my attorney, Your Honor." A beat of silence, then a laugh, low and dismissive. "Son, this isn't a traffic court," Judge Baxter said, flipping through the file. "You're being sued for breach of contract and defamation, with a counterclaim for intellectual property theft. That's 3 branches of law. You sure you want to try this little experiment here?" "I'm sure, Your Honor," Whitney smirked. "Should make for an entertaining morning." Darius didn't flinch. He didn't scowl or bristle. He simply reached into his folder, pulled out a 1-page motion, and handed it to the bailiff, who brought it up to the judge. "What's this?" Judge Baxter asked. "Motion to exclude Exhibit C of the plaintiff's evidence," Darius said calmly. "It violates the rules of discovery and contains privileged communication between Veriton and a third party who never waived confidentiality." Judge Baxter squinted at the paper, then glanced at Whitney. She frowned. He's not licensed to practice. He doesn't have to be licensed to file a motion," the judge muttered, scanning the content. He even cited Harris v. Brundage. Clever. He didn't sound pleased about it. "Well," he sighed, "we'll review the motion after opening statements." The gallery murmured. One intern at the back whispered, "Wait, Harris v. Brundage. That's a federal precedent. Most first-year associates screw up." Darius remained silent. He rose only when asked to deliver his statement, walking to the center of the courtroom with a quiet power. No theatrics, no bluster. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "I stand before you not because I'm unqualified to have counsel, but because the truth should speak for itself. What you're about to hear is not a defense made from desperation. It's a case built from facts one's Veriton Global doesn't want you to see." Whitney immediately objected. "Improper characterization." The judge waved it off. "You'll get your turn, Ms. Crane." Darius nodded and continued. "I worked at Veriton as a software engineer. I designed a data security algorithm that they now claim as their intellectual property. But what they won't tell you is that the project was off the clock, built on my personal machine, and submitted under my own copyright. When I refused to transfer ownership without compensation, they terminated my contract and accused me of stealing my own code." He looked at the jury. "Now they want to bury me." He sat down. Silence stretched in the room for a few seconds longer than normal. Whitney stood with forced elegance. "Well, that was touching," she began, immediately launching into her statement full of corporate language, legal threats, and accusations that made Darius look like a disgruntled ex-employee trying to make a quick buck. When it was time for evidence, she submitted neatly bound binders, each with tabbed sections, color-coded exhibits, and flash drives. When Darius was called to cross-examine a company representative, Martin Kelton, a senior VP, he walked to the stand with nothing but a notepad. "You stated in your affidavit that the file named VeriShield_V2.0 was developed entirely by Veriton's R&D team, correct?" "Yes." "Can you tell the court what programming language the file was written in?" Kelton blinked. I believe it was Java." "Incorrect. It was Python," Whitney objected. "Relevance." Darius smiled. "Establishing false technical claims? It goes to credibility." "Overruled," Judge Baxter said slowly. Darius turned back. "And can you tell us why the file was found on my home computer 2 weeks before I uploaded it to the company repository?" Kelton stammered, I don't know." No further questions. Darius sat down, and for the first time, Judge Baxter looked directly at him, not with amusement, but with something closer to scrutiny. During recess, a clerk approached Darius quietly. "I'm not supposed to say anything," she said under her breath. "But you're really good," Darius smiled. "Thank you." Back in session, Darius submitted a motion to compel the court to review internal Veriton emails between executives discussing removal of Bennett and seizing project code. Whitney tried to suppress the emails, citing confidentiality, but Darius had already found a loophole. An internal whistleblower had forwarded them to the State Labor Board as part of a separate ethics complaint that made them public record. The judge was visibly annoyed. "Where did you even learn to file half these things?" "Studied during lunch breaks, sir." The jury chuckled. As the day wore on, Whitney's arrogance began to falter. She'd underestimated him, so had Judge Baxter. Darius, however, didn't gloat. He moved methodically, professionally, with the humility of someone who knew the weight of being counted out before he even opened his mouth. Flashbacks layered between court sessions revealed more of Darius's background. Raised by a single grandmother in Detroit, self-taught in coding, studied legal theory from secondhand books. He once interned at a law office, but had to drop out of law school after his scholarship fell through. Yet even then, he never stopped studying. He had built a career and a reputation. Veriton tried to erase that. Back in court, he finally stood to examine the digital trail metadata, timestamps, encryption, keys, all showing that the source code originated from his personal laptop, not the company's server. When Whitney tried to claim chain of custody issues, Darius showed that the code had been registered under his own name on GitHub months before joining. Veriton. Judge Baxter leaned forward now, fingers steepled. "I'll admit," he muttered, "this is turning into quite the case." That afternoon, the courtroom sat in tense silence as Darius issued a single, stunning challenge. "I request the court to subpoena internal audit records from Veriton's compliance division, specifically regarding Project Sentinel launched after my termination, using my proprietary codebase." Whitney visibly paled. "That's confidential, not if it uses my copyrighted material," Darius said coolly. Judge Baxter sighed deeply and turned to his clerk. "Get me that audit. Recess until tomorrow." As the gavel fell, a young law student in the gallery looked up from her notes and said softly, "That man just outplayed one of the best firms in the state." Darius packed up his files as calmly as he had entered. He ignored the cameras waiting outside. He had no press team, no entourage, just one man, against a machine that never saw him coming. And tomorrow, he would come back stronger. By the next morning, Courtroom 3B had become the most talked about room in the entire courthouse. What had started as just another civil hearing had morphed into something far more compelling. The janitor had to unlock extra rows of gallery seating. Reporters were spotted blending into the back row. Even a few lawyers on break from their own trials lingered in the hallway just to peek in. Inside, Darius Bennett sat alone at the defense table, calm as ever. He wore the same suit from the day before, a modest navy ensemble with slightly frayed cuffs, but he carried it like it was tailored. His briefcase was open, files perfectly arranged, each tab labeled in tiny handwritten script. He reviewed his notes, not like a man defending himself, but like one running the courtroom. Judge Ronald Baxter entered through the side door, his expression more serious than yesterday. He didn't smirk this time. He didn't chuckle. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and said, "Mr. Bennett, Ms. Crane, let's proceed." Whitney Crane looked sharper than ever. Her legal team had doubled overnight. Flanking her were 2 associates and an IT consultant, all of them whispering furiously before the hearing began. "Your Honor," Whitney began, rising confidently, "we move to dismiss Mr. Bennett's request for the Veriton audit on the grounds of irrelevance and lack of admissible connection." Before the judge could respond, Darius calmly stood. "Your Honor, the audit directly references my code. If Project Sentinel used my work, which it did, then Veriton's own internal compliance reports will prove ownership and exploitation." Whitney snapped. "This is circumstantial conjecture." Darius didn't flinch. "No, Ms. Crane. Evidence." He reached into his folder and produced a printed copy of a GitHub repository. "Before I joined Veriton, I published segments of my code to an open-source forum under my own handle. That handle is linked to my email, which is registered to me alone. Your own metadata confirms the exact timestamps match those of the supposedly proprietary Veriton files." He turned to Judge Baxter. "I'd like to enter this repository documentation into evidence." The courtroom was so silent you could hear the scribbling of the stenographer. Judge Baxter stared at the papers, then nodded slowly, admitted, "Let's take a short recess while I review the audit report." While court paused, word of their performance was spreading. A law clerk from another room ran down to watch. A young black associate from a nearby firm sat in the gallery with tears in her eyes. "He's doing what we dream about," she whispered, "alone, and still winning." Back in session, the judge's face was unreadable. "Mr. Bennett," Baxter said, "the audit report confirms that Project Sentinel began 3 weeks after your termination, and it does include your code." Gasps echoed from the gallery. Whitney stiffened. "However," Baxter continued, "we still need to determine whether that code was transferred to Veriton under contract." Darius gave a slight nod. That's where this comes in? He pulled out a signed copy of his employment agreement. Clause 14 states, any work product developed independently, not during work hours, and not using Veriton property or systems, shall remain the intellectual property of the employee unless otherwise negotiated. Whitney shot to her feet. That clause was struck in a later version. Darius raised an eyebrow. Which version? Because this is the one I signed. He walked it up to the bench himself, holding the original, complete with inked signature and a notary stamp dated 4 days before his official employment began. Judge Baxter reviewed it carefully. Whitney leaned toward her team, whispering frantically. The junior associate beside her looked pale. I believe, the judge said, we're starting to see the core of this dispute. And Mr. Bennett, for someone without a law degree, your filings are surprisingly thorough. A flicker of admiration passed over his face, quickly masked by professional stoicism. Darius didn't respond. He simply took his seat. Later, during cross-examination, Whitney brought forward Veriton's director of human resources, hoping to undermine Darius's claims. Isn't it true, she asked, that Mr. Bennett signed an NDA specifically stating any innovations he worked on would belong to the company? Yes, the director replied. That was standard policy. Darius stood when his turn came. Ma'am, he began gently, can you confirm the NDA you're referencing was signed electronically? Yes. Can you verify the system timestamp on that signature? She hesitated. I'd have to check. Darius turned to the judge. Your Honor, may I submit an IT forensics report? It shows the NDA was digitally modified 3 days after my termination date, using Veriton's internal account credentials. I never signed the version they're referencing. A beat. Judge Baxter looked stunned. You're claiming document forgery. I'm stating a fact. The report was entered into evidence. Darius had used publicly available forensic tools to analyze the metadata embedded in the document file. He wasn't just proving ownership, he was proving deceit. The courtroom buzzed again. Whitney's team scrambled to respond, but their rhythm was gone. The momentum had shifted. That afternoon, Darius called a surprise witness, Lucille Vaughn, a former Veriton paralegal who had resigned in protest months earlier. She was nervous, twisting her hands as she took the stand, but her voice was firm. Left because I couldn't be part of what they were doing, she said. They altered documents. I saw emails about Bennett's code being rebranded as internal property, and I tried to speak up. I was silenced. Whitney rose, objection, hearsay overruled. Judge Baxter said quickly, she's testifying. From direct knowledge, Lucille continued. Darius reached out to me weeks ago. He didn't threaten, he didn't beg, he just asked me to do the right thing. And I couldn't stay silent anymore. The gallery was dead quiet. When Darius resumed his seat, he didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just adjusted his notes and prepared for closing arguments. The truth was enough. Later that evening, after court recessed for the day, Darius sat alone on a bench outside. The sun was setting, and his body ached from the hours spent standing, pacing, and arguing. But he didn't feel tired. He felt alive. A boy approached him around 10, black, holding his mother's hand. Are you a lawyer? The boy asked shyly. Darius smiled. Not officially, not yet. The mother nodded. We've been watching. You're giving people hope. Darius looked out at the courthouse. That's all I ever wanted to do. The next morning, the judge entered court slowly, a bundle of papers in hand. The courtroom was at full capacity. A legal podcast was live streaming audio summaries outside the courthouse. Before we proceed to closing arguments, Judge Baxter announced, I want to say this clearly. This has become one of the most compelling cases I've presided over. Mr. Bennett, though self-represented, has demonstrated a level of legal acumen that rivals most attorneys who stand before me. I say that without exaggeration. The room buzzed. I will allow closing arguments, and I urge the jury to consider the full scope of this case, not just the legality, but the integrity. Whitney's closing argument was rushed, scattered. She tried to argue Darius was a disgruntled employee, that the audit was incomplete, that Lucille was bitter, but the damage had been done. Her credibility was shot. Her team had made too many assumptions. Then it was Darius's turn. He walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. He didn't speak for a full 5 seconds. When he did, his voice was calm, steady, and powerful. When I first walked into this courtroom, people laughed. Maybe it was my skin, maybe it was my suit, maybe it was the fact that I dared to defend myself. But I knew the truth, and the truth has no title, it has no credentials. It only needs to be heard. He turned to the jury. They thought they could steal from me and silence me, but I'm still standing. I stand not just for myself, but for every person who's been told their voice doesn't matter, for everyone who was underestimated, for everyone who ever heard a door slam and thought it was the end. He paused. I studied law not in a classroom, but in life, in pain, in injustice, in determination. And I ask you not to pity me, not to favor me, but to see what they tried to hide. He walked back to his table and sat down. Silence. Even the judge didn't speak for a few moments. Finally, he dismissed the jury for deliberation. Outside, the media swarmed. Reporters clamored to get quotes, cameras flashed. And through it all, Darius walked straight to the front steps, hands in his pockets, face calm. He'd done all he could. Now, it was in the jury's hands. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Outside the courtroom, the crowd had swelled. Word had spread far beyond the courthouse. Local news vans lined the street. A group of law students huddled together, live tweeting the trial. Civil rights advocates, tech workers, and ordinary citizens who had followed Darius's case from the start stood behind barricades, waiting to hear the outcome. Inside, tension simmered like a boiling pot. Darius Bennett sat alone at the defense table, as he had from day one. His hands were folded neatly in his lap. He wore the same suit, though it was a bit wrinkled now, his tie slightly loosened, his shoes scuffed, but his posture was unshakable. He looked every bit the man he had proven himself to be, composed, principled, brilliant. Whitney Crane fidgeted. At the plaintiff's table, her army of attorneys had been whittled down. One had taken a family emergency, another had called in sick. It was clear they wanted no part of the fallout. Veriton Global's top executives were nowhere to be seen. The bailiff opened the side door. "Jury has reached a verdict," he announced. The courtroom hushed. Judge Ronald Baxter adjusted his robe and nodded. "Bring them in." 12 jurors filed in. Some looked tired. Others looked deeply moved. One, a middle-aged black woman, held her head high, her chin trembling. "Madam Foreperson," the judge began, "has the jury reached a unanimous decision?" "We have, Your Honor." "What is your verdict?" The foreperson unfolded a sheet of paper, glanced at Darius, then spoke clearly. "In the case of Crane versus Bennett, we find in favor of the defendant, Mr. Darius Bennett." A single, collective gasp filled the courtroom. The tension cracked like glass. The foreperson continued, voice unwavering. "We further find that Veriton Global engaged in willful misrepresentation, document forgery, and wrongful termination. We award damages in the amount of $2.5 million to Mr. Bennett, and an additional $500,000 in punitive damages." Whitney's jaw fell open. Judge Baxter blinked, genuinely stunned. He turned to Darius. Double quotes, "Mr. Bennett, do you wish to make a statement before we adjourn?" Darius rose slowly. He looked not at the judge, but at the jury. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for the verdict, but for listening." He turned to Judge Baxter. "And to the court, I submit a final motion. I request that Veriton's financial penalty, or a portion of it, be directed to a public legal education fund specifically for communities that rarely see justice served." The courtroom erupted into applause despite the judge's attempts to restore order. "You're not allowed to," he began, then stopped himself. His eyes met Darius's. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "I'll consider it," Baxter said. "Court is adjourned." Outside, the crowd exploded into cheers the moment Darius stepped onto the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Reporters shoved microphones toward him. "Mr. Bennett, how did you do it without a lawyer? What are your next steps? Have law schools offered you admission? Are you planning to sue Veriton?" Darius raised a hand. The crowd went silent. "I didn't do this to become famous," he said. "I did it because I was tired of watching people like me be crushed by systems that were never designed to hear us. I learned the law so I could survive. I used it so others could thrive." One reporter pushed through. "There's a rumor that the state bar is reviewing your case for special certification. Any comment?" Darius smiled faintly. "If they are, they know where to find me." He walked through the crowd. No entourage, no limo waiting. Just a quiet man with a briefcase and a purpose. A week later, Darius stood in a modest office in downtown. Dietrich, the walls were bare. A whiteboard leaned against the wall, and a hand-painted sign sat above the door. "Justice First Legal, ad opening soon." He was setting up folding chairs when the door opened. It was Judge Baxter. Darius straightened. "Didn't expect to see you here." Baxter looked around. "Someone told me you were opening a clinic. I had to see it for myself." The judge cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." Darius arched an eyebrow. "You do? I laughed at you. In court? Assumed you were just another fool playing dress-up with the law, but you proved me wrong. I've seen a lot of lawyers try to bluff their way through trial. You studied it, lived it, bled for it. That deserves respect." Darius nodded slowly. "Thank you." Judge Baxter hesitated, then extended a hand. "If you ever want a formal recommendation to join the bar, full privileges, I'll write it." Darius shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that, but right now, I think I'm more useful doing this." Baxter glanced around again. "You're going to be dangerous out here, Bennett." Darius smiled. "Only to the ones who think people, like me, don't belong in court." The following month, news of Darius's victory made national headlines. Legal blogs dubbed him the pro se prodigy. Civil rights groups invited him to speak. Law schools reached out with offers, full scholarships, even honorary degrees. He declined them all. Instead, he recruited 2 young paralegals, both former students of online law courses, and started running free community legal clinics in Detroit's most underserved neighborhoods. He taught people how to file motions, challenge evictions, fight wage theft, and demand justice. He never asked for payment. One day, while teaching a class on tenant rights, a young black boy raised his hand. Mr. Bennett, how do you know all this if you never went to law school? Darius smiled, grabbed a marker, and wrote 3 words on the whiteboard. I paid attention. Meanwhile, Veriton Global suffered a cascade of lawsuits. Investors pulled out, executives resigned. Whitney Crane resigned from her firm and disappeared from public view. Her fall from grace was as swift as her arrogance had been. The legal world whispered of a new era, one where truth could no longer be dismissed simply because it didn't wear a $1,000 suit or carry a JD from Yale. And at the center of that shift stood a man who had walked into a courtroom alone, laughed at by a judge, doubted by everyone, and walked out a symbol of justice. Months later, on a quiet evening, Darius visited his grandmother's grave. He stood for a long time, holding a single white rose. They laughed, Nana, he whispered, just like they used to. But this time, I didn't back down. He placed the rose on the grave and knelt. You always said I was meant for something bigger. I think this might be it. He stood, eyes steady, and walked back to his car. World was waiting. And now, it would hear him.